Welcome to the working world. I'm Kara Mendez.
And I'm Jamie Lingham.
Jamie, we had a conversation today with James Bingham, who is the Director of Alidade Australia. What an amazing conversation.
I tell you what, Karen, there's a whole thought piece. I mean, where we started, an hour ago to what we ended up with, as far as content and ideas and concepts. People returning to the office or not returning to the office. It's this whole science, this alchemy of sort of possibilities. And I think that James, is obviously highly passionate about it. He really hit the nail on the head. And I suppose, given the fact that Absolute Immigration as a business is actually looking at exactly this topic at the moment, I know we are not alone. I know a lot of other people who are running other businesses or involved with companies are all going through the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, James's organisation, Alidade, is working, with organisations around their hybrid working model. But it's fascinating around the depth of lengths that organisations or he's providing support to around this. I mean, Alidade does efficiencies around demand and supply of real estate ecosystems. It uses occupancy simulation technology, which is fascinating, and then it provides that deep understanding to organisations around their workplace behaviours and then how economics factor into all of that. So, I mean, some of the, I guess, the highlights and the takeaways that James left with us was, obviously on most organisations, P&Ls, the two biggest line items are real estate and people. And whilst people, I guess, is being impacted the most, or certainly making the headlines the most at the moment from some of the downturn that's happening, I think, the next focus area will be real estate, if that's, the next thing on the profit and loss as far as big ticket items.
Absolutely. And I think that, maximising space and looking at, do you keep continuing leases, etc. There's a whole massive piece in here for everyone else who's sort of going, or other those of our viewers who are going through this at the moment. I think it's definitely a worthwhile listen.
Yeah, definitely. Enjoy, guys, and thanks for watching.
Thanks, guys. Okay, enjoy it.
James, welcome to the working world. Lovely to have you. How are you?
Yeah, very well. Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Pleasure. You are going to talk to us today about organisations, how they use their space, what solutions are available. So if you're okay with it, I'm going to jump straight in and not give Jamie any room to comment at all.
Oh, you just got me. Good call, Karen. Good call.
Let's do it.
I was just about to dive in there.
So James, look, obviously the decision to call people, employees more importantly, back to the office, for set periods of time or days appears to still be an ongoing conversation that many organisations are having and grappling with. I guess as somebody who works with organisations going through this conversation, what are you seeing as the current trends around return to office versus remote working?
Yeah, it's a challenging question. I think, as you rightly say, Kez, there's a lot of organisations trying to figure out and find the right balance, right? And it's a balance between, I guess, what employees are trying to achieve with their lives, and obviously everything sort of changed throughout the pandemic, and the way that employees started to understand the relationship to the office changed. And it was really interesting in that now employees have a vast array of decisions that they're making every day when it comes to, well, how do I consume real estate, right? Do I go into the office? Do I stay home, right? What do I need to do to be effective? Right? What are the activities that I have on during the day? Do I have a day worth of meetings, a day worth of Zoom calls, right? Why would I go into the office if I have to be on Zoom all the time? All these decisions are being made by all the employees. And it's, we talk a lot about the fact that the agency is changing, right? Previously, employers would say, here is where you do work, and this is the place you go. Now it's very much changing to the employees making that decision and being able to navigate through that themselves. Yeah, and particularly as we think through things like what is happening outside of our work lives, and how does that impact what we do and how we consume work as well? So things like, what do you do with the kids, right? What happens if one of a child is sick? What happens if I have to go to the doctor, or the cleaner's coming today? All these things that we have to start navigating through, which change our relationship to the office and to that physical space. What's also really interesting, and the data is showing us some fascinating things, is that there is a distinct difference between the intent, so what I say I'm going to do, and what I'm actually doing. Right? There's a huge difference in this behavior. People will say, and organizations might make a policy to say, come in 3 days a week. We're seeing the data showing us that people, if you're lucky, they'll go in 1 day a week, maybe 2, right? Because something comes up on that other day. I've had an early morning phone call, and then I've got all these things backing up, which just changed the way that I behave. And that's fascinating to see from the data, but that creates that creates a problem, and it creates a really hard situation for organizations when they're trying to plan, right? And they're trying to understand who is going to show up, how many people are going to show up, like how do I turn on parts of my office? How do I turn off parts of my office? How do I adjust to all of these things? And I guess one of the big things that we're seeing, particularly with a lot of organizations at the moment, is really trying to navigate through the why of the office. Right? Why do I want people back in the office? Is it because I need to justify my expense on my office real estate? Is it because leaders believe work needs to happen in a certain way? We believe collaboration happens much better in person than in a remote session. All of those things that we're trying to navigate through as well. So it's a really complicated time, right? Because all these things are happening, right? And that has direct implications with how many people show up in the office, and what are the ways that people are consuming that sort of space.
James, I'm bang on in your zone at the moment. We are looking at we have I'd say a fragmented workforce, as in a lot of people are working from home. We have people who don't want to commute the hour each way that some of them do. Some of them have family pressures, looking after kids. I suppose being at the start of the journey, my feel is that most people don't want to do the travel. I think, waking up and having your toast and your coffee and rolling straight onto the computer is easier. What are you finding the sort of main resistance points are about, people? Obviously, I think managers want to do this for their own reasons, which you mentioned before. But what's from an individual point of view, what are the biggest areas of resistance you're finding?
Yeah, and I think you hit on one of the main ones, which is around the commute. It's the effort to go into the office. Right? And so part of the things that we try and talk through a lot is this idea around how do you remove the friction, right? So if I'm an employee, I'm trying to make a decision on where I want to go and what I want to do. I want to make sure I'm productive, but I want to make sure I'm in the right place for whatever that productive means for me.
Yeah.
And there's a really there's sort of there's a saying that's been going around the industry at the moment, which is this idea of how do we earn the commute, right? So how do we make sure our spaces earn the commute of people and encourage them to come back in? Because you need to give them the reason, right? It's not so much about organizations saying, well, you have to come in. It's being able to create the spaces and the environment and the experience that brings people in. So it's a little bit of a shift in thinking and a little bit of a shift in sort of how we approach the purpose of the workspace.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's almost like an incentivization, James, then to get them back.
Yeah, exactly. And it's always a really interesting sort of discussion around, right? How do you incentivize employees? And so I was at WeWork for quite a while in New York, and we always talk with this idea with clients around this idea of cultural confetti, right? So, which is like the ping pong in the corner of the office, the ping pong table, sorry, right?
Yeah.
They're putting on muffins and pizza and all that sort of stuff, which seems to be great in the moment, but really difficult to sort of to scale, and becomes really hard for people to continue to sort of see the value in those things. So creating those environments it's not an easy task, right? Because you have to then get back down to this question of, well, why do we have the office, right? Why do we have the space? What is it that this space adds that is different to their office at home, or their lounge room, or even the cafe down the road, right?
Yeah.
How do you create that environment? How do you navigate through that?
Yeah. So I would imagine, though, that question is kind of resonating wider than just the organisations themselves or just the corporates, right? Like, how is, I guess, commercial real estate, the people behind the businesses that are taking up their properties, how's commercial real estate responding to, the decisions that corporates are making around this feedback or behaviours they're getting from their employees? And how is that changing, I guess, organisations' real estate commitments that are being made or not made?
Yeah, it's a really interesting dynamic that's happening at the moment. So, I thoroughly think we're starting to see real estate become a commodity, right? It's becoming a productized element. So we're starting to consume real estate in the same way that we consume other retail devices, right? We're starting to see this change that we need real estate to adapt to the needs of me as the individual, or to me as the team that needs to work in that real estate, as opposed to sort of the traditional method where it's just, here is your four walls, you go into those four walls, that's where you will be. So we're starting to see, organizations starting to adjust to this, all these decisions that are happening from an employee basis. We're starting to sort of see them starting to reassess what that space means for them. So organizations, we're seeing requests for shorter leases, for added flexibility into how they consume that real estate. They're starting to go to the landlords and asking the landlords for, for extra capabilities within the buildings that they're going into, which is creating a really interesting dynamic for the landlord, because now you've got to start building these capabilities into your assets. So you've got to start building things like meeting rooms on demand, right? You've got to have some version of on-demand desk space, right? Project space, right? So, or client meeting rooms even, right? Places where you can go and that you can consume in an on-demand way. Right? So we're starting to see that shift. And there's a narrative that's going through the real estate industry at the moment, which is this idea of flight to quality. Right, so organizations are moving up the value chain in terms of the assets that they're in, so the buildings that they're in, and they're looking to the better quality buildings, and they're saying, I can go into that building, I can probably take less space, I might pay more for it, but I get a better experience.
Yeah.
But I really like to sort of shift that narrative a little bit and say it's a flight to capability. Right? It's a flight to going into these assets, going to these buildings that have the capabilities that these organizations want, right? And so, every building in the city has a end-of-trip facility, for example, right? That was all, 10 years ago, that was the big thing. Nowadays, it's about, how do I have desks? How do I have access to meeting rooms? How do I have access to these project spaces? Right? These are the things that organizations are looking for capabilities, when we need to be able to sort of start building those capabilities in. But that then changes the way that organizations are starting to look at their real estate. So we all know that, there's big global economic forces at play. We're starting to see some contraction. We're starting to see, some layoffs. We're starting to see, as my wife would say, where organizations going into resilience mode, right? So sort of bunkering down and starting to make sure that they can see through this period of uncertainty. So often we see with organizations, they have, the two biggest line items on their P&L, people and then real estate, right? There's the two main things that exist there. So if there is an opportunity to start reducing real estate costs, so the CapEx and the OpEx associated with real estate, you would rather do that than sort of having to start reducing your workforce, right? So that's sort of how we're starting to see that shift, I guess. Yeah, we're starting to see this, people looking to add on-demand, pay-as-you-go type real estate products, right, to their conventional leases. So they're creating almost this hybrid structure that we're seeing, which is it's a bit of a mind shift for the industry, because we've always traditionally just said you have an office and that's where you go, right? And that is your space. Now we're starting to see that shift happen, right? And it all goes back to the fact that you and I, we wake up and we make different decisions.
So James, just on all this, I mean, it's really, in my mind, it's sort of been that the co-working space pre-COVID was a thing, and obviously still is a thing. It sort of feels like more of a thing. I know that's not a technical term, but I'm just running with it. Are you finding that there's a new sort of paradigm coming in? And where I'm going with this is, say, for example, my building, we have, I'd say, occupancy of the team coming at the moment might be 30 to 40%. And so what I'm thinking in my head is there a way I can lease out part of my building to I suppose, maximise the value that I'm paying, and look for those, because I know of companies that have actually, since COVID, who have closed their physical office, and who might bring people into a co-working space 1 or 2 days a week just to get that, sort of socialisation, learning, all that sort of stuff. But for people who are land owners or business or building owners or even leaseholders, are you seeing a new, cohort emerging where this sort of space sharing is becoming something?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's sort of, I think for the owners, so if you separate that out a little bit, so owners are starting to adjust to this dynamic, right? And they're starting to build in these capabilities, and we're seeing it with some of the big owners here in Australia who are doing some amazing things, right? For leaseholders, so for tenants with long-term leases, the problem does become a little bit more difficult, right? And it's a bit of a function of the fact that the sublease market in Australia, and to be honest, globally, except for maybe in sort of Southeast Asia, but globally, the sublease market is horrible at the moment, right? There's so much space that people are trying to do the same thing, right? And they're just struggling to get other organizations to see that space and see the value there. But I think there's some other sort of more creative solutions that we could be looking at, and I think that there's the possibility to start looking at that, let's call it the excess space. So let's say it's 30% of your office, 20% of your office, whatever that is, right? How do you structure that? And, let's say you're bringing in, I don't know, external teams who you want to work with, partners that you're working with, or bringing in, innovation organizations that are helping you as a company grow, right? And so there's really interesting things you can do. Just creates it requires a little bit of creative thinking to sort of navigate through that.
So you're saying to bring them in-house. Sorry, Karen. You're saying to bring them in-house. So, for example, if I'm doing a campaign or some other sort of initiative with the business, maybe that I suggest to those suppliers, hey, do you want to come and work in-house? Obviously, I'm not going to get the maybe financial benefit, but I might get the face-to-face interactive benefit.
Yeah, exactly. So doing things like that, for other types of organizations, let's say you want to run you want to run a hackathon, for example, right?
Yeah.
You've got a space now that you can start bringing all those people in, right? And so you gain that, the benefit of being face to face and the benefit of proximity. So you've almost, you've got this like innovation space or this socialization space. You've got it there ready to go. Again, it's just there's obviously some sort of logistical challenges you need to work through, right? Security and privacy and all those things, which are not insurmountable. It just, again, requires a little bit of thought and a little bit of planning. But yeah, there's some interesting creative ways you can think through that.
So James, for organisations that I guess are still trying to bed down their remote versus office-based approach to hybrid working, what other solutions exist to aid corporations in their use of their office space to handle that flex workforce?
There's a lot of solutions out there that a lot of products out on the market at the moment, which purport to help understand what's happening in the workplace and help to really sort of give you the data, I guess, to understand what's happening. So there's a lot of buzz at the moment, and it has been for a little while, around the idea of sensors, right? So sensoring space. So putting in, whether it's occupancy sensors, heat sensors, movement, etc. Now, sensors by themselves are, they're a great product. They tell you a lot about what's happening, but without having, a strategy, without having sort of, let's call it a hypothesis that you're trying to answer, sensors for sensors' sake don't really give you great data. They don't give you great information around what's happening. So it's really hard. By just having sort of one solution, it's really hard to find out what is happening with an organization unless you start fusing that with some of the other systems that you might have in-house. So, for example, if you look at Wi-Fi data and you start merging that with, let's call it HR type data, right? And then you start looking at things like organizational and team policies together. So those three bits of data, you can start understanding who's coming in, how often they're coming in, what teams are coming in, how are the teams working together, how are your organizational strategies and decisions that you're making affecting that occupancy, right? And so you can start really understanding just with three basic pieces of data, which most organizations will have access to, if not all, right? That data set can tell you so much around how an organization is operating, right? And you probably don't need to go to the extent of spending tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars putting in sensor solutions, right? So really it's about understanding what are the questions that we're trying to answer, right? What are the things that we need to be able to understand, and then what are the solutions that we might already have to be able to understand what is happening within an organization. And then I think, when we look at a bit of a broader concept, and we spoke obviously about co-working and on-demand spaces. In Australia, we have some amazing operators out there. We have some amazing flex operators who are best in class, right? Best in the world at what we do. Who have taken the learnings from some of the past failures that the industry has had, and starting to understand how people want to consume their space, and starting to understand how they work with kind of the owners, right? And so understand, how can I put my flexible product into a building, and then how can I get that building to help me engage all the other employees and all the other tenants in that building to be able to provide that experience that we're all looking for, right? So there's multiple products out there. I do think the flex angle is really interesting. I think sort of from co-working, we can add a lot of value into the system, if that makes sense.
So just sort of continuing that theme on productivity in particular. I mean, I'm imagining that there's different people that have different personalities and different responses. So I'd be guessing that there's some people who are highly productive outside of the office, and others who aren't. Have you come across many sort of instances or companies that are looking at that from a, sort of try to categorize these people and have a strategy that actually works to each of the personality types?
Yeah, absolutely. It's was actually happening. So about 4 years ago, I was working with a healthcare company in the US called Humana. So they're a large healthcare company headquartered in Kansas City. And what was really interesting is that their workplace team had basically worked with every single business unit and every team within every business unit to essentially start categorizing the employees and how the employees operated within their space. Yeah. And essentially start to assign measures of, are you a desk-bound worker? Are you a hybrid worker? If you're hybrid, how often are you in the office? Are you an at-home worker? What is the things about what infrastructure you need as well? So, specialty units need specialty infrastructure. That infrastructure is probably only available in the office, right? So, and this was all happening again, sort of pre-pandemic, right? And some of these organizations just really sort of understanding their workforce, and therefore being able to understand, what are the space types that I need to have to be able to service that workforce, right? And I think this sort of, a lot of this tails back into what we were talking about earlier, of this sort of, this decision matrix that's happening. Because I think, I sort of think most employees want to be productive, right? We want to be in the place that makes us productive. We're all adults. We can all sort of decide that, I want to do the best thing for me and for my job and everything like that. And I think we start to make those decisions. And I think sometimes those decisions get lost sort of by, these overarching policies that we put in place. By categorizing and by assigning sort of people with the right modes to be productive, if you will, and again, this changes, it's fluid, right? It's fluid with the things that we're working on all the time. So yeah, I think there's ways to do that, and there's definitely benefits, but it's also worth sort of understanding from a basic level, right? How do I sort of create that base condition and then allow people to flex in and out as they need to, depending on whatever they need to do to get their job done.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I can tell you from my own experience at 3:20 or 3:30 when my kids rolled in to home, I don't want to be at work. I don't want to be at home, sorry. I want to be in the office because it's just madness, right? Like the whole place, it's just got kids asking you questions. You're on a Zoom, you're sort of like, hang on a second. It just gets, up until that point, from 9 till sort of 3:20, life's good. And then after that, it just sort of goes a bit sideways.
Yeah, I can validate that as well.
So that's an interesting it's an interesting use case, because there's a number of organizations in around the world who are taking up what I would call we sort of core and flex, which is the idea of like you have a central hub and then you have these sort of flexible locations. And there's a couple of organizations here in Melbourne particularly who have created what we call near home solutions. Right, so they have flex operators who are in let's call them suburban locations, and have been able to essentially strike a deal where their workers are able to access these near home solutions, with a swipe card, whatever that is, right? And so if they need to go there for an afternoon or an hour, right, to get some headspace and to get some quiet time, right, that's a space they can they can drive 5 minutes down the road instead of having to go all the way into the CBD or wherever their office location is. And so, yeah, it's interesting to think through those solutions, different ways that you can accommodate real estate to the needs of your employees.
Yeah, because I've been thinking about that recently, because you have these either industry events or conferences, or for a few hours, and you travel into the city for an hour for it, and then you travel an hour back. And by the time you do that, you wipe out half your day. So it's it'd be interesting to see how much that those options, which you call near home solutions, they sound fascinating. I haven't heard those before, James. They're great. But I guess I imagine they're somewhat similar to a co-share office solution, right? They're just outside of that kind of city proximity. I mean, those co-share office solutions have existed prior to COVID. They were obviously quite popular now, and as their popularity grows, how can organisations start to take advantage and integrate them into their, I guess, overall solution or portfolio?
Yeah. So I think, with the pandemic gave, I guess, showed us some really interesting things. So co-work, particularly in Australia, co-working, and in the US as well, co-working absolutely boomed post-pandemic. There was huge demand for this flexible office space, which was fascinating to be honest. So, and you could probably read into it many things, whether you want to escape your kids or whatever that is, right? You can read into that how you
escape
will.
your kids probably doesn't sound the best, but
I think we're, as I said before, we've got some fantastic operators here in Australia, and these organisations, because of the quality of our operators, we're starting to see organisations start understanding how they can build that into their portfolio, right? And so starting to see the value in, whether it's like Hub Australia, for example, starting to see the value with that as part of their sort of corporate identity, and the way that they think about, their corporate brand and things like that. But we're also seeing a lot of these organizations, when they start getting sort of, let's call it, down to the detail of really understanding, right, how many desks do I take in Hub, right? What teams do I put there? What teams do I need to have in head office? Right, all these questions. We're seeing some organizations just kind of take a bit of a dartboard approach, right, and just sort of just try and make it up and see how they go. That we're seeing some organizations being a little bit more detail orientated. And part of the reason why we set up Alidade as a company was to really start to understand things we talked about before, right? All these decisions that are happening, all these things that are happening with how we consume space. What does that mean for an organization? And as these organizations are going through resilience mode, as they're starting to see the global economy contract and all these things are happening, how do they start to still provide the experience that we need to provide, right? And still provide the wellness benefits that come with being in an office, with all the collaboration benefits, all the things that we know that an office can provide.
Because I think it's a really interesting line, or something you brought up earlier, was really talking about how it becomes part of your identity. And we're finding that when we interview people now is, the flexibility is an important part of why people would come and join us. So, would we attract the same amount of people if we said 5 days a week to 3 days a week to 1 day a week? I just find that really interesting. So to that end, I think, are you finding people are advertising that through job ads, or, like how do you communicate there's flexible, but how do you also manage up those other business needs, like we were talking about before, or the business benefits that come from, whether it's stopping in a remote, or not a remote, but a region, not a regional, a suburban, there you go, I got it third time lucky, suburban sort of working space that I can go into. So how do you sort of make that as an attraction piece, or are you finding people are doing that through their advertising? Or
I think there was it's the employee retraction and attention sort of discussion is particularly sort of a big thing here in Australia at the moment. Whether that continues is going to be interesting to see, just given everything that's going on. I do think that flexible spaces, and I think flexible spaces that are integrated well, and I think that's a really important point, right, is making sure that when organizations add some version of a flexible space into their portfolio, that it's integrated in a really a seamless way, right?
Yeah.
And I think we'll see more and more of this coming, in the future as flex and co-working evolves, and as occupiers and owners start evolving as well in terms of the way that they think about flex and the way that they build these products, is that we will see this, let's call it this unification of experience, right? And so being able to create an experience where if I'm in a flex space, my experience there, the technology there, the hospitality in that space is the same as what I've got upstairs in my headquarters, or down the road, or in the city, wherever that is. And that unification is going to be really important, because as we're creating the experience and as we're using that experience to attract people into our office and attract the right employees and the right caliber of employees, they are looking for different things in the value proposition, right? So they're looking for the ability to work flexibly, or they're looking for the ability to have a great experience at work. So we need to be able to provide those. There are real estate products that can provide that, right? And we need to make sure that we integrate them properly into our portfolios.
Because that integration too extends to things like, and you spoke about hospitality, but also like culture, and the overall, I guess, experience, as you mentioned, within the office itself, which is, I guess, it would be tricky to replicate, because if, especially in a co-working space, I mean, what are you finding, or what's Alidade focusing on in relation to kind of solving for those, myriad of different aspects to kind of bring that all together and help with that integration?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's for us, it's like the experiential and the cultural side. These are obviously really important parts and things that leaders care about so dearly, is sort of how do we navigate through that. But I think there's almost a sort of a base layer that we need to get right first, right? Which is, I think about purely the economics of space, right? And so understanding what is the space types that we have, how can I make sure that I can afford the right spaces to then be able to build on top of that an experience, and be able to build the culture that I want to create, and use that space to be able to create that culture. And so what we do, we concentrate on building that base level infrastructure, if you will. We start, and we work with a lot of companies just to understand, how do I think about occupancy in my office? Right? How can I start to predict out how many people are going to show up? Right? What days are they going to show up? What's the interaction between teams, right? And all these sort of questions that I'm trying to navigate through, which then allow me to say, well, I have a certain mass of people turning up on a Tuesday and a Thursday, for example. No one turns up on a Friday because everyone wants to hang out at home. Right? Everyone wants to go down the beach early, whatever that is. Right? And so that creates some really interesting patterns. And those patterns have direct implications to how much should I be paying for space? How often are my meeting rooms used? How often is this really expensive boardroom that I built? Right? One of the most expensive pieces of real estate that I have, how often is that going to be used? Right? And what is the cost of the underutilization of that particular component? And when you start to understand that, then we can start to say, well, it makes sense for, in your headquarters, it makes sense to build these things. But in your on-demand type spaces, it makes sense for you to be able to have access to a boardroom, 2 times a month, right? On a Tuesday at whatever time, right? And so by doing that and being able to understand what's happening to the space, all the things that sit around that, all behaviors that employees are doing, to be able to get yourself to a place that you understand what are these real estate products that I need to have to then be able to build on top of that, all the experience and all the cultural side of things, right? So if I want to have, a headquarters and I want to have all these near home type locations, that creates an experience, and that then promotes a certain sort of cultural side of that organization.
Yeah.
So you've got to understand, get the infrastructure set up first, and then we can start to build on top of that.
Yeah, and add the, what do you call it, cultural confetti.
The cultural confetti.
I love that one.
Avoid the confetti, but build the culture.
I love it.
Just a question. It's quite interesting. In my mind, I think obviously COVID and skill shortages sort of mostly, predominantly driven us to this point that we are today. If there isn't, I can't remember the phrase that your wife called it, moving into a sort of challenging time. What was that? What did she say again?
Resilience mode.
That's it, resilience mode. I've been making notes as we're talking, and I actually can't believe I missed that one. But as we move into resilience mode, do you think that's actually going to start moving the balance of power? And I don't want to say in a bad way, I'm not saying all employees want to get their staff back in, but do you think it will start to shift a bit where employers will go saying, well, listen, James, you want to come and work for us, it's 5 days? Do you think that will happen, or do you think we'll sort of still operate in this world where people can say, look, I'm not too keen to get on the train or commute in for an hour each way, I'll go elsewhere?
I think that it's an interesting question. It's an ongoing debate, right?
Yeah.
I have a point of view which to say that I think what we'll see, and the way that sort of organizations will start to navigate through this, going back to the things we were talking about at the start, right? What is the point of the workplace, right? Why do we have this space? Why are we spending, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars on real estate every year, right? Just to be able to force people to come back in.
Yeah.
And so, and that to me, that equation doesn't really make sense. And we saw what was interesting throughout COVID, there's some sort of interesting data sets that basically say that organizational productivity, once, and however you define productivity, it's a fairly loose measure, but, with, apart from obviously a bit of a dip during sort of as we were all adjusting, but we all got back to a place where everyone was still able to produce the things they need to produce, right? And so, and obviously there's differences here, and again, you can argue to the cows come home, right? But I think that there's an interesting dynamic that says we all learned that we could be effective employees working in places that aren't the office. Yeah, when we all learned that fact. And so, as an employer, I would look at that and say, well, what is the value of this big real estate thing that I have? Because again, real estate is one of the most expensive items on a profit and loss sheet. So what's the value in that real estate? If there is an opportunity to be more effective in that real estate, isn't that a better thing than just telling people they have to come in, right? And then, people losing all this sort of experience that they've created and all, the connections with their kids, whether they want to be there or not, all those sort of things, right? So how do you, I think there's 2 points of view there. One that says we want to bring everyone in because we have this big office and we need to justify having a big office, or it's we can rethink the office, we can rethink the structure of this big real estate thing that we have. We can still be productive, we can still output the same level that we did, prior to the pandemic. And I think this is that shift in thinking that we have to navigate through.
I guess, Jamie touched on it about, what's coming down the pipeline, but I guess for those that are kind of looking at their P&L, or it's around about budget time and they want to look 12 months in advance, do you think the needle is going to shift much on the status quo? And by that, I guess I mean we're still in a state of flux, the conversation's still going on, people are still finding their groove when it comes to hybrid or flex working. Do you think the needle's going to shift much in 12 months and they can make some definitive decisions around that budget bottom line, I guess?
I think what we'll see, and again, depending on who you talk to, is always an interesting conversation.
This is our crystal ball question. We love this one.
You can go round and round the wheel on this one. I think that in Australia, the way that we've consumed real estate is starting to change. As we've been saying, organizational policies are going to start shifting to allow, let's call it this non-traditional real estate to be consumed. I think that previously, and maybe still to a certain extent, the emphasis has been on this idea of experience, it's wellness in the workplace, it's using the workplace to attract or retain employees. Obviously there was a lot of sort of mental health issues that came out of the pandemic. The workplace is being seen as one way to start navigating through some of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think what we'll see is there's going to be a little bit of shift in that thinking, right? And it's not to say it's all like doom and gloom for the employees, but I think there's going to be a little bit of shift to say, again, global economy, there's some contraction, there's a lot of layoffs happening. We saw Xero laid off a bunch of people, I think it was 2 weeks ago. We see everything that's happening in Silicon Valley, where they're starting to reduce headcount quite significantly. So if there's a way that we can shift the focus on real estate, we can start reducing the costs associated with that real estate. We can use the products that are out there because they exist today, right? We use the real estate products that are out there to create a solution or an environment that meets the experience needs of our employees, but also creates a beneficial economic outcome for the organization. And that's what we're going to start seeing. All right. Okay. And that's reducing purely the amount of square meterage that we might have, for example. Right. Consuming, as I said, using on-demand or flexible type products as part of our portfolio. All of that together is going to create an experience that we want to create, but it's also going to end up being far more economically advantageous for the employer as well.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing, isn't it? It's it really sounds like it's. It is a lot more complex than when we first sort of waded into this conversation. I see that there's so many factors, but making sure that there's an economic benefit at the end of it, not suddenly paying for this suburban space and paying for this, office modifications or anything extra like that that's just going to keep adding cost. It really has to be a well thought out plan. It sounds like you have your work absolutely cut out for you, James, which is great. It's good for you. I think, I know myself personally, I've been making copious notes. I'll have a chat to you further offline because I can tell you there are a lot of unanswered questions I have. I do sort of feel like I'm paying a lot per person for the space we have. I'd be interested to look at other ways we can sort of utilise that. But it's been really great, highly informative, and where we were sort of 45 minutes ago or 50 minutes ago to where we are now is it's light years apart. So thanks for all your knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. This is my favourite subject. I can talk on this for hours and hours. So
love it. That's what we need. We need people like you to do it, to do that, to be passionate and keen to do it. Yeah.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been great.
Thanks, James. Thanks for your time. It was a pleasure. And thank you for those few quotes. Cultural confetti and resilience mode. Got it.
Absolutely. And we'll put details in obviously in the episode of people, how they can contact you. It sounds like you consult globally, which is great. So, more power to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, guys. All right.
Thanks, James. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.